The Siege of Leningrad was a military blockade undertaken by the Axis powers against the city of Leningrad in the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front of World War II from 1941 to 1944. Leningrad, the country's second-largest city, was besieged by Germany and Finland for 872 days, but never captured. In August 1941, Germany's Army Group North reached the suburbs of Leningrad as Finnish forces moved to encircle the city from the north. Land routes from Leningrad to the rest of the Soviet Union were cut on September 8, 1941, beginning the siege. The Germans decided to bomb the city rather than attempt to capture it. Many residents starved during the winter of 1941 to 1942. Supplies were delivered to city by air, by ship over Lake Ladoga, or over the Road of Life. A highway built on the lake when it was frozen. A Red Army offensive opened a narrow land corridor to Leningrad on January 18, 1943. But the siege was not fully broken until 27 January 1944. Army Group North under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb advanced to Leningrad, its primary objective. By early August, Army Group North was seriously overextended, having advanced on a widening front and dispersed its forces on several axes of advance. Lieb estimated he needed 35 divisions for all of his tasks, while he only had 26. The attack resumed on August 10 but immediately encountered strong opposition around Luga. Elsewhere, Lieb's forces were able to take Kingisepp and Narva on August 17. The Army Group reached Chadovo on August 20, severing the rail link between Leningrad and Moscow. Tallinn was captured on August 28. Finnish military forces were north of Leningrad, while German forces occupied territories to the south. Both German and Finnish forces had the goal of encircling Leningrad and maintaining the siege perimeter, thus cutting off all communication with the city and preventing the defenders from receiving any supplies.
On the south, another army group, under General Gerd von Rundstedt, with an armored group under General Paul Ludwig von Kleist, advanced from southern Poland into Ukraine against Kiev, whence it was to wheel southeastward to the coasts of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Last, in the center, north of the Pripyat marshes, the main blow was delivered by General Fedor von Bock's army group, with one armored group under General Heinz Guderian and another under General Hermann Hoff, thrusting northeastward at Smolensk and Moscow. The invasion along a 1,800-mile front took the Soviet leadership completely by surprise, and caught the Red Army in an unprepared and partially demobilized state. And were at Minsk, 200 miles beyond it, on June 27th. At Minsk they converged with Hoth's tanks, which had attacked from the northern flank. But Bock's infantry could not follow up quickly enough to complete the encirclement of the Soviet troops in the area. Though 300,000 prisoners were taken in the salient, a large part of the Soviet forces was able to escape to the east. The Soviet armies were clumsily handled and frittered their tank strength away in piecemeal action like that of the French in 1940. But the isolated Soviet troops fought with a stubbornness that the French had not shown. And their resistance imposed a break by continuing to block road centers long after the German tide had swept past them. The result was similar. Having crossed the Dnieper River on July 10th. Entered Smolensk 6 days later and converged with Hoth's thrust through Vitebsk. 200,000 Soviet prisoners were taken. Nevertheless, by mid-July the Germans had advanced more than 400 miles and were only 200 miles from Moscow. They still had ample time to make decisive gains before the onset of winter, but they lost the opportunity, primarily because of arguments throughout August between Hitler and the OKH about the destination of the next thrusts thence. Whereas the OKH proposed Moscow as the main objective, Hitler wanted the major effort to be directed southeastward, through Ukraine and the Donetsk Basin into the Caucasus, with a minor swing northwestward against Leningrad. In Ukraine, meanwhile, Rundstedt and Kleist had made short work of the foremost Soviet defenses, stronger though the latter had been. A new Soviet front south of Kiev was broken by the end of July, and in the next fortnight the Germans swept down to the Black Sea mouths of the Bug and Dnieper rivers to converge with Romania's simultaneous offensive. Kleist was then ordered to will northward from central Ukraine and Guderian southward from Smolensk for a pincer movement around the Soviet forces behind Kiev. By the end of September, the claws of the encircling movement had caught 520,000 men. These gigantic encirclements were partly the fault of inept Soviet high commanders and partly the fault of Stalin, who as commander-in-chief stubbornly overrode the advice of his generals and ordered his armies to stand and fight instead of allowing them to retreat eastward and regroup in preparation for a counteroffensive. As winter approached, Hitler stopped Lieb's northward drive on the outskirts of Leningrad. He ordered Rundstedt and Kleist, however, to press on from the Dnieper toward the Don and the Caucasus. Bach, meanwhile, was to resume the advance on Moscow. Bach's renewed advance began on October 2nd, 1941. Its prospects looked bright when Bach's armies brought off a great encirclement around Vyazma, where 600,000 more Soviet troops were captured. That left the Germans momentarily with an almost clear path to Moscow. The Battle of Kiev can be considered an unprecedented defeat for the Red Army, which caused more damage than the battles of Minsk and Smolensk. The counterattacks of the Soviet Bryansk front to prevent those incidents were unsuccessful and caused the loss of about 100,000 soldiers and 140 tanks out of an initial 260,000 soldiers and 260 tanks. After these defeats, the Bryansk front was in a chaotic state, and less than 3 weeks later, when the Wehrmacht's concentrated offensive towards Moscow began, it had only 200,000 troops to face it. With the southwestern front completely destroyed, the Soviets were forced to rebuild it from scratch and to fill the gap created in the south of the front line, transfer its forces from the central sector. The victory in Kiev was considered one of the prerequisites for the advance of the Army Group Center. Once it was achieved, the German Army High Command returned their focus to the central part of the front and resumed their push to Moscow. With their success in the Kiev region, new hope was immediately created amongst German command about the success of this front. The destruction of the Soviet southwestern front opened the way for Army Group South to advance to the east of Ukraine without facing any resistance force. In addition, the large amount of equipment captured in the Kiev region enabled the Wehrmacht to advance without waiting for resupply. Finally, during the 8 weeks that the Battle of Kiev was going on, Army Group Center had the opportunity to recover and strengthen its worn-out forces and improve their supply situation, and its infantry divisions were able to join the motorized forces at the front line in a relatively slow march to the east. The Red Army lost significant forces, which could have been used for defending Moscow. In addition to dominating the vital economic lands of the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht secured the southern flank of its Army Group Center and dealt a heavy blow to the Soviet forces. The encirclement of the Kiev region was the last successful major breakthrough that the Wehrmacht's panzer forces over a long distance that the Germans carried out in the Soviet Union. The German troops, who occupied Kiev on September 19th, were surprised by a series of explosions from Soviet radio mines in the city center from September 24th onwards, the first of which also killed a number of local civilians. The damage caused to the German forces as a result of the explosive traps that were planted in Kiev by the Soviets caused a change in the Wehrmacht's approach to capturing large cities in the continuation of Operation Barbarossa. Hitler forbade accepting such risks again in conquering large fortified cities with direct attacks. Especially without panzer units, it was decided that the cities should be left behind and besieged by artillery fire and air attacks. Hitler used that strategy and prohibited the entry of troops into those cities.